Hey there, I'm Pastor Luis Medrano. We're going to continue on our series, The Life of Jesus Christ. Today, we're going to look at Jesus Christ after he finished his business at the temple. He had a conversation with Nicodemus, and now he's headed north to Galilee, and he's going to go through Samaria, and he's going to meet an incredible woman at the well. So who is she? Let's take some time studying the Gospel of John chapter 4 and find out who is this woman that Jesus meets on the road to Galilee. So let's get our study started. We're going to look at the Gospel of John chapter 4 verse 1 on. Now the Bible says, "Now when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee, and he had to pass through Samaria." So what's happening? Jesus was in the temple, he had his conversation with Nicodemus, but there was resistance growing against Jesus Christ. In the Gospel of Matthew chapter 4 verse 12, it says, "Now when he heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew into Galilee." So Jesus is now feeling a sense that it's time to go. He's going to go north to Galilee. When people traveled to Galilee, either from the north in Galilee to the south and to Jerusalem, or vice versa, they tended to go along the Mediterranean Sea. There was a highway there that you could take, or you went along the Jordan River area, the King's Highway, or the way of the ocean there. But you never went through the center unless it was completely necessary, because in the center between Galilee in the north, Judea in the south, was Samaria. And what's interesting here in the text, it says that Jesus was going to head up to the Galilee area, but he had to go. It says he had to pass through Samaria. And when it uses that language there, he had to, it gives me a sense of that there's a providential meeting that's going to take place. Something was predestined to happen. It has to happen. And so what we see here in the text is that Jesus is going to go with the disciples because the Pharisees, the Jews, they're not responding well. As long as John the Baptist had his following, they focused a lot of his attention on him, but now they've arrested him. And now they learn that Jesus and his disciples are baptizing even more than John. So it's time to get out of town, and he's going to go through Samaria. Verse 5 continues, "So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour." I'm going to import a little bit of information that we'll learn a little later. But it says that Jesus was wearied. He was tired. I'm assuming he's hungry, he's thirsty, and he stops by Jacob's well. And the point is, it was about the 6th hour. We're getting little bits of information that are going to become really important to us. And so one of the questions that I would have at this point is, where's your followers? Where's your disciples? Even though they haven't been formally called, they're still with him. They're still following him. So where are they? You're going through dangerous territory. Samaria. Someone should be with the master. Someone should be watching the teacher. And yet none of them are there. Well, you'll find out later that Jesus sent them ahead. He told them, "Go on ahead of me, go into town, let's buy some groceries. I'm hungry, I'm tired, you guys go ahead." And so I start to think, well, how many guys is he going to send to go buy these groceries? Apparently all of them. He sent all of the disciples ahead of them. This is important. Remember that. He sent them all ahead of him. It says it was about the 6th hour. That means when you think about the time, the way the Bible shares it with us in the New Testament, time would start at 6 a.m. So 6 hours, that means this is noon. This is high noon. The sun is right above them. It's the noon hour. Verse 7 says, "There came a woman of Samaria to draw water. And Jesus said to her, 'Give me a drink.'" we need to take a moment here and think about what's happening. We need to have a little cultural understanding of how women were seen, how Samaritans were seen. This woman is defined, first of all, by her gender. And I need you to understand, during the time of Jesus, women were not looked at in any dignified way by the majority of the world. Within Judaism, there was some protections, there was some dignity found, but most of the time, women were to be quiet, they were to be busy, they were to be out of the way, don't create problems. You're not important enough to give any attention to. I know that sounds horrible, but that was the majority of view. So men, when they saw women, they didn't consider them. They were unimportant. And all of a sudden, a woman has presented herself. And she's not just a woman, she's a Samaritan. One has to remember that in the history of the Jewish people, in the year 722, there was some invaders. The Assyrians came in and they conquered the northern area of Israel, and they took away a lot of the young, the beautiful, the strong, the intelligent, and they left behind the miscreants, the criminals, the mentally challenged, generally bad people. And over time, those people were mixed in with the locals. And the children that were being birthed to these new family units were called Samaritans. So they were half Jewish, half Assyrian. They're called Samaritans. And at least we think the majority were from Assyria. They could have been from any other country, but they were called Samaritans. And the Jews tended to look down upon Samaritans. They had some issues with them because when in the time after the captivity, southern area of Israel was also conquered, and even though they didn't go to the extreme they did in the north, they did destroy a lot of the community, the temple. And so many of the Samaritans, the young, came and said, "Let us help you rebuild. We want to be a part of this community." But the Jewish people saw them as a product of God's judgment and rejected their help. They pushed them away. Every time those young Samaritans tried to help, they were pushed away and they were rejected by Jewish society. And over time, this created resentment in the Samaritans. So you have a whole history of animosity between Samaritans and the Jews down in Judea. What's interesting is that in the north, in Galilee, it was a more metropolitan area other than the city of Sepphoris, where you had a high density of Jewish elite. The majority of Galilee was a multicultural setting where everyone got along and they respected each other and they lived peacefully. It was not so down in the south, and so there's this conflict. And right away, Jesus is all alone. He's tired, he's hungry, he's thirsty, and he's sitting at a well, and a woman comes, someone you're not supposed to pay attention to, a Samaritan, someone who's an enemy of your people and a product of God's wrath and anger, and she sits down near him, and Jesus opens up a conversation. You're not supposed to do this. This doesn't normally happen culturally. And verse 8 says, "For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food." They want you, the author is emphasizing, nobody else here. It's just Jesus and this woman. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." That latter part of verse 9 literally means that Jews and Samaritans don't share dishes. We don't do that. We don't share cups. We don't share dishes. Why are you even talking to me? I'm a woman. I'm a Samaritan. Don't you know what the culture is of the day? Jesus answered her and said, If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him and he would have given you living water." Now I want to remind you, previously, Jesus had a conversation with Nicodemus, and he brought up the issue of water. If you notice, ever since the first miracle, water is a theme in almost every story. And what Jesus is saying, woman, if you knew who it was that is asking you for a drink, you would have asked me for a drink. And I think he's referring back to the same thing he did with Nicodemus. The words in Titus chapter 3, verse 5. If you remember what it says there, it says that God, he saved us not because of works done by us in righteousness, but according to his own mercy, by the washing of regeneration and renewal of the Holy Spirit. So Jesus is saying, if you knew who I was and what I have to offer, you would have asked me for this life-giving water, this water that would literally save your soul. It continues on here in verse 11. The woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep." What's interesting here is, just like Nicodemus, she doesn't get it. She doesn't understand. I want to take a pause for a moment, because there's something that's interesting here. We can do a compare-contrast with Jesus' encounter with this woman as well as with Nicodemus. If you remember, when Jesus met Nicodemus, look at the antithesis here. Look at the comparison contrast. Nicodemus, we know his name. This woman at the well, we don't know her name. Nicodemus was a Jew. This woman is a Samaritan. Nicodemus was educated. We assume this woman is uneducated. Nicodemus was a rabbi, politically elite. This woman seems to be an outcast, somewhat marginalized. Nicodemus was respected and connected. This woman is disconnected. Remember, Nicodemus came and met Jesus at night. This woman is meeting Jesus noon, in the middle of the day. Notice how these two stories are being perfectly compared and contrasted. And so she's sitting there with him and said, "Sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water?" And I think her confusion is this. She's saying, every day I come out here and I have to go, and it would have been about a mile and a half just south of the city. She says, I've got to walk out here, it's hot, and I've got to carry these. But if you know of a place with living water, and for her, living water would have meant a fountain, an aquifer, someplace with a brook, a running water. If you know someplace closer with sweet water rather than this nasty, dirty water, please tell me. I want to know. I want my life to be easier. You know, there's another point here that I think we need to talk about just for a moment. Why was she going out at noon? Most women would have gone out at the early morning, 6 a.m., at the very first hour of the day. And it would have been a group of women. They wouldn't have gone alone. And it would have been a busy time, but it would have been a fun time. See, all the women could come down, and as they're drawing water, this is a social time. It's a time to connect, reconnect, talk, share. It was a time of fellowship for the women, and they'd all do this job together, and then they'd go back into town with their daily water. This woman apparently was not invited, not included, and she didn't participate. She needed to go when nobody was at the well. Why is that? Many commentators have said that she was a woman who was not accepted. Quite possibly she was a prostitute. She would have been rejected, and none of the women groups would have allowed her to be with them. And in order for her own safety, a precaution maybe, she would go when she felt no one was there. And so Jesus is meeting a woman who may be a woman of ill repute, who's a Samaritan. So there's all kinds of issues. Where he met Nicodemus, a very well-respected and included man, now he's meeting a woman who's seriously rejected. And the woman responds in verse 11 and says, "Sir, you have nothing to draw water with. The well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Where can I go get some of that? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock." Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty forever. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." Again, speaking to regeneration, the renewal of the Holy Spirit. The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water again." And Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come here." So Jesus, again, remember, Jesus knew the hearts of people. He knew their mind and their intentions. And he gets past all of her questions, just like he did with Nicodemus, and he addresses the issues of her heart. And he says, "Go and call your husband." The woman answered him and said, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You are right, you're being honest, in saying I have no husband. For you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true. The woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. And so she's going to attempt to change the story here. She goes on and says, Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. So Jesus touched a tender spot here. And she says, wow, you know things about me. You must be a prophet. Let me ask you some theological questions. Jesus isn't about to buy that. He sticks with it. You know, before we go on in our study, I want you to take a moment and think. It's discovered that this woman has had 5 husbands, and the man with which she is now is not her husband. Why? I would want to know, what happened to 5 husbands? Remember, women were being married as early as 13, 14, 15 years of age. So to go through 5 husbands, what happened? It's possible that, you know, maybe a husband died, there was an accident, maybe a husband didn't care for her, so he divorced her, maybe another husband abandoned her. I can't come up with enough reasons to figure out how she's gone through 5 husbands, and the guy that she's with now is not her husband. What happened? Well, I don't know, but what I can share with you is that whatever the story is, whatever the reason, it's a tragedy. It's sad. This woman is being rejected by her community. She's not included in the family of the community, and she's gone through so much pain and suffering. I can't imagine the pain in her heart. Jesus, because he knows our hearts, he sees that, he directs his attention, and he begins to ask her. She's trying to go a different direction, asking some theological questions, and Jesus is going to respond to it in verse 21. He says, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. What Jesus is doing here is he's saying, listen, you're concerned about the where to worship, whether it's Mount Gerizim or in Jerusalem. What I'm here to tell you is that God is more concerned about your heart. He's more concerned about you being honest with what's happening in your heart, that you would worship him in spirit and in truth. And you've just taken the first steps. You spoke truthfully about those tragic pains in your life. You're laying yourself out before him. You're admitting the situation with your husbands. You're literally confessing yourself, and you're taking the first steps. Good for you, because God is looking for people where the rest of society doesn't consider a woman. God does. And even though you're labeled as a Samaritan and there's cultural issues, God's not concerned with that. He's concerned with your heart. And verse 25, the woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called the Christ. That's where my hope is, that there's a Messiah. And he says, when he comes, he will tell us all things. And amazingly, just like John wants us to know, in verse 26, it says, Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. This is the first time Jesus will say those popular words, I am. I am the Messiah. I am divine. I am the Son of God. In verse 27, just then his disciples came back. All of a sudden there's a break in the story. It was a great conversation, but then the disciples get back. And so what do they find? They find their teacher sitting alone with a woman who is a Samaritan who might be a prostitute. You tell me, how are they going to respond to this? My guess is that many of them, well, it might be a diverse response. Some of them will say, what are you doing? You know that you're a rabbi. You're not supposed to be around her kind. You know, she's not of us. She's not of our faith. This woman has made horrible decisions, Jesus, and you're associating yourself. Don't you know we don't share dishes? Don't you know we're not supposed to be about that? Verse 27, just then his disciples came back. They marveled that he was talking with a woman, but no one said, "What do you seek?" or "Why are you talking with her?" They were all hushed. They were thinking a lot of things, but no one was speaking. So the woman left her water jar and went away into town and said to the people, "Come see a man who told me all that I ever did. Can this be the Christ?" I'm going to stop there. Imagine this. If it's true that this woman is a prostitute, if this is true that she's had 5 husbands and the man that she's with is now, is a 6th person she might be with, imagine this woman going into town saying, "I found a man. I found a man." The town would have said, "Yeah, we know. That's kind of what you do." I know it's a horrible joke, but it's interesting, don't you think? It's interesting that that's how it's laying it out. So the disciples came back, and one has to wonder, they didn't say anything, but remember, Jesus knows their hearts. He knows what they're thinking, He knows what they're feeling, and this is what we call a teaching moment. So, question, going back to the beginning of the story, why did Jesus send all the men? I know we guys are not great shoppers, but did it really take all of them to go buy some food? Why did Jesus insist on going through Samaria? He insisted on all of them going ahead, and He followed. My thought is this. I think that Jesus sent these men, His followers, His disciples, ahead of Him because they would have gone down the same road, passed the same well, and seen the same woman He did. And the hope would have been, at least the aspiration would have been, that they would have done what their master would do, that they would have had compassion, that they would have overcome their cultural barriers, that they would have seen her not as a woman, but as a child of God in need. They would have known, this woman is here at noon. She has a tragic tale. We should have some compassion on her. But instead of stopping, they must have thought like everyone else did culturally, you know what? This woman made mistakes. This is a woman we don't have any business talking to. This person doesn't even attend our synagogue. Not a member of our group. So each and every one of them went past her. And how sad, because when they come back, they find their master doing exactly what they should have done. Don't you see that? And so here he is, he's having this conversation, and they're like, wow, I should have done that. And they have nothing to say. So when we're reading this story, it's very easy for a teacher or a pastor, if you're leading a Bible study group, maybe you're the kind of person that says, if I teach this lesson, this is important. We should not be like these disciples that just because she's a woman, just because she's a Samaritan, she's a different culture, she's not a member of our group, that shouldn't keep us from sharing dishes, of fellowshipping, of communicating. This is a message about us being more open to culturally diverse and reaching out to people. While that is all super good, it's not the point. See, so easily, because we tend to be entitled and think greater of ourselves, we put ourselves in the position of the disciples. But listen to me. In this story, you and I are not the disciples. Are you ready? We are the woman. We are that marginalized, rejected person. We are that sinner. We are that person who's showing up at noon, full of guilt, who has a tragic tale. This is the point of the story. Who is it that Jesus is looking for? He came to seek and save those that are lost, those that show up at the well at noon, those who have tragic tales, those who believe that nobody else would care for them, and every other religious person just passes you by. They don't notice, they don't care, but Jesus cares for you. It doesn't matter how tragic your story is. It doesn't matter what the cultural ramifications are. Jesus sits down and He says, if you only knew who it is that's talking to you. Wow. What an incredible moment for any one of us to sit down and consider. He knows all about me. Is He a prophet? And instead of changing the story, maybe we, like the woman at the well, can just simply worship Him in spirit and truth and not hide our tragic pain, but offer it to Him and know that He's going to sit down next to us, and where everyone else would reject us, He's going to spend some time with us. Well, I hope this Bible study has blessed you. I hope that it's a powerful reminder of the love of Jesus for you. And just continue to study, and let's continue on learning about the life of this incredible God-man, Jesus. And remember, I'm always pulling for you. So what do you think? If you enjoyed this video, then make sure you click on the like button below and leave me a comment. And make sure to subscribe for even more amazing content. And remember, I'm always pulling for you.